They horsewhipped the widow for her late husband's mistakes, until a gunslinger drew the line. The sound came before the picture. A crack, then a second, and I'd heard enough such sounds in enough such places to know what it was before I pulled Cutter to a halt and sat listening in the scrub cedar at the edge of town. You learn, after a while, to place the sound of a bullwhip the way you learn to place thunder, by distance, by what follows it. Thunder follows itself with rain. A bullwhip follows itself with a voice, usually, and the voice tells you everything you need to know about what's happening. The voice I heard was Cord Delvin's. I knew Cord, not well but well enough. Big man, wide through the chest, the kind of man who wears his size as a credential. I'd passed through Hatcher's Creek 2 years back, stayed 3 days, long enough to eat 2 hot meals, and lose $1 at cards to a man named Elias Prout, who had the worst poker face I ever saw and still beat me twice. Long enough to know Cord Delvin ran the creek's supply business out of a warehouse at the south end of the main street, and that his word on debts was the kind of word that didn't leave room for argument. I hadn't planned to stop. I was riding through, same as I always ride through places. Hatcher's Creek was on the way to Sutter Pass. Sutter Pass was on the way to the Wyoming line, and the Wyoming line was where I had a job waiting, or where a man named Foss had said there was a job, which is a different thing entirely. I was 41 years old, trail sore, carrying an extra $2 from a poker game in Redfield, and a bruise above my left eye from a disagreement outside a livery in the same town. I was not looking for trouble. But that second crack came, and then the third, and then the voice stopped, and what filled the silence after it was worse than the voice had been. Nothing, not a sound from whoever was on the receiving end of that whip. I turned Cutter left and came out of the cedars at a walk. The main street of Hatcher's Creek ran maybe 400 yards from the water trough at the north end to Delvin's warehouse at the south. It was not a town that held a lot of beauty at the best of times, dry, wind-scoured, the false fronts on the buildings bleached to the color of old bone. Mid-morning, the sun was already the kind of hard that made you squint before you could take a full look at anything. There were maybe 15 people in the street. They were all standing back from something, the way people stand back from a fire, not so far they couldn't watch, not so close they'd be touched by it. A rough circle, men mostly, 2 women at the near edge, one of them with her hand pressed flat to her mouth. Cord Delvin stood in the center of that circle. He was holding a coiled bullwhip in his right hand, and beside him stood a younger man I didn't know, 20s, narrow-faced, wearing a vest over no shirt, which looked as deliberate as a costume. At Delvin's feet, on her hands and knees in the dirt of the street, was a woman. She was not young. 40, maybe a year or 2 either side. Dark hair, half come loose from its pins and fallen across one cheek. She was wearing a work dress, gray-blue, and the back of it was cut open from the shoulder to the waist in 2 places where the whip had found her. I couldn't see blood from where I was, but I didn't need to. She hadn't made a sound. That was the part that had quieted the street. I think, not the whipping itself, but the fact that she had taken it without a sound, and every person standing there watching knew what that kind of silence cost. Delvin said something. I was still 30 yards out and his voice had dropped, so I caught the shape of it but not the words. She lifted her head, said something back. He raised the whip. I put Cutter into a trot. I didn't think about it. That's the truth, and I'm not going to dress it up. Some decisions happen in the part of you that's below thought, and this was one of them. I heard the whip come back and I pressed my knee into Cutter's flank, and we covered those 30 yards at a trot, and I put the horse between Delvin's arm and the woman on the ground, and the whip came down across Cutter's haunches instead of her back. Cutter shied left but held. Good horse, always was. Delvin looked up at me. He had a broad face, reddened by sun and by something else besides sun, and his eyes were the pale flat blue you see in men who have gotten used to not being refused. He looked at me the way a man looks at a fly that's landed on something important, mildly annoyed, ready to be rid of it. "Move off," he said. I didn't move off. I sat there on Cutter with my hands loose on the reins and looked down at him, and let him look back at me long enough that the silence got a weight to it. "I don't know you," he said. "No," I said, "you don't." "Then move your horse and keep riding. This is a business matter." "What business?" I said. "Requires a bullwhip and a woman on her knees in the street." He squared his shoulders, and I saw the younger man in the vest shift to his left, beginning to move around Cutter's head at a wide angle. I marked where he went without moving my eyes from Delvin. "Her husband owed me $400, Delvin said. "He's dead, she's what he left. I'm collecting what I'm owed. Debts don't transfer to widows in any law I know." "Out here," he said, "I am the law I know." Which was probably true. I thought about that for a second. Behind me, I heard it, the soft sound of her getting to her feet. Not fast, the kind of careful movement you make when you're not sure your legs will hold. I reached back into my saddlebag without hurrying, took out the roll I'd won in Redfield, peeled off what I estimated was close to $40, and held it out to Delvin. "For her husband's debt," I said. He looked at the money, didn't take it. "It's $400, he said. "I know what you said it was. This is what I have. Take it and call it a down payment and give the woman 60 days to make up the rest, or don't take it, and we'll see where the next 5 minutes takes us." The man in the vest had come around far enough. I could feel him out there, maybe 8 feet off my right shoulder. Delvin knew I could feel him, because he knew the kind of man he was looking at. We'd both been doing this long enough to read each other, and what we each read was not good news for the other. The town was very quiet. Delvin looked at the money one more time, looked at me. Something moved behind his pale eyes, some small calculation that came out the way calculations in men like him usually come out, which is toward the path that doesn't cost them anything today. He took the money. 60 days, he said. He gave the narrow-faced man a look I didn't like the shape of, and then he walked away south, toward his warehouse, and the man in the vest followed, and the circle of watching people broke apart the way circles do when the thing at the center is finished. I got down off Cutter. She was on her feet, standing straight. I'll say that first, she had her feet under her and her back as straight as she could hold it, given what her back had just been through. Her hair was still half down, and there was a cut at the corner of her lip from where she'd hit the ground, and she was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not quite. Something more careful than gratitude. Something that was still measuring whether I was another version of the same problem I just walked her out of. "Are you hurt badly?" I said. "I've been hurt worse," she said. Which wasn't an answer to what I asked, but I let it stand. "I'm Virgil Kane," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Nora Prout," she said. Prout, the name sat there for a second. "Elias Prout's wife," I said. Something changed in her face. "You knew him." "I played cards with him 2 years back. Lost $1. He beat me with a pair of 4s and a lot of nerve." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Her lip was cut and she was in pain, and she had too much pride for a smile right then, but the suggestion of one. "That sounds like Elias," she said. I didn't say what else it had sounded like, which was that a man who bluffed on a pair of 4s and called it skill was exactly the kind of man who might run up $400 in debt and then die before he had to look it in the face. I kept that to myself. The dead are past arguing with, and she was his widow, and she'd just been whipped in the street for what he'd left behind. "Is there somewhere you can go?" I said. "Someone in town?" "I live here," she said, "out at the Prout place, 3 miles north." "You shouldn't ride 3 miles like that." "I've ridden 3 miles in worse condition than this," she said, and the measuring look was back. She was doing it again, deciding how much of my help she wanted, and I understood that, because I'd just seen a man exercise his idea of help over her with a bullwhip, and she had every right to be careful about what help from a stranger looked like. "My horse is at the livery," she said. "I came into town for flour and lamp oil." "I'll get your horse," I said, "and your flour and your lamp oil, and I'll ride out with you until I can see your home safe." She looked at me for a long moment. The sun was doing something sharp to her face, and I could see the lines around her eyes and mouth that came from years of outdoor work and wind and probably worry besides. And beneath all of that she was a good-looking woman, clear-eyed and straight-nosed, and holding herself together with an act of will that was not nothing. "Why?" she said. "Because Delvin's got a man with him who moved around my horse while Delvin was talking to me," I said. "And men like that don't forget, and you've got 3 miles of open ground to ride." That landed. She didn't like it, but she was a practical woman, and practical women don't refuse a truth because it's inconvenient. "All right," she said. I got her horse from the livery, and I got her flour and her lamp oil from the general store, and strapped them to her horse's saddle, and she came out of the back of the dry goods store, where the owner's wife had helped her with her dress as best she could, and we rode out of Hatcher's Creek together heading north. She didn't speak for the first mile. I didn't push her. I rode a half-length behind and to her right and kept my eyes working the brush on both sides of the road, which was less a road than a pair of wagon tracks through dry grass and rocks, and I thought about Delvin's calculation and whether it had come out right or wrong for me. I did not think it had come out right. Men like Cord Delvin do not take $40 of a $400 debt and walk away feeling settled. What they do is walk away and reassemble themselves and wait for the moment when the problem, meaning me, is no longer in their calculation. Which meant I had put myself between him and the woman, and I was now the thing standing in that space, and the space was not going to close up just because I'd handed over $40. I'd known that when I did it. I told myself I'd known it. I'd done it anyway. I'm not sure what that says about me. I've asked myself over the years since, and I've never come up with an answer I was entirely satisfied with. "He's been at us since February," she said. I didn't say anything, waited. "Elias died in November, fever. Fast 4 days from the first sign to the end of it. There wasn't time to put anything in order." She had her eyes on the road ahead, and her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has told a story enough times that all the raw edges have been worn off it. "Delvin came out to the place in December. Said Elias had borrowed against the ranch. Said he had papers. I'd never heard Elias mention borrowing anything from Delvin." "Do you still have the ranch?" "I do. Whatever Elias borrowed, he borrowed it on his own name, not on the land. I had a man look at the papers. The land's mine." A pause. "Delvin doesn't like that." "No, men like Delvin do not like land they can't get their hands on." "He's been making it hard," she said. "Little things at first. The man he sends to town started telling people not to sell to me on credit. Then one of my fence lines came down. I thought it was wind, but now I don't know. And then this morning I came in for supplies and he came out of his warehouse and—" She stopped. I let the stop sit. "He said in front of everyone that I'd had enough time and enough chances, and he was going to collect from me one way or another." "Who was the man with him?" I said. "Young one, vest." "Del Farris. He works for Delvin, does whatever Delvin needs done." She said it in a particular tone that told me what Farris was without her having to say it, which she probably didn't want to say out loud on an open road. I filed that. The Prout place came into view at the top of a low rise, a ranch house, small but solid, with a barn that needed new boards on the south side and a corral with 3 horses in it. A kitchen garden to the east of the house, and beyond it a long stretch of grass that ran all the way to the tree line, which was cottonwoods, which meant there was water over there. It was not a grand piece of land, but it was land and it was hers, and I could see why Delvin wanted it. She pulled up in the yard and I helped her down from her horse, and she let me. which told me her back hurt considerably more than she'd said. Her face didn't give much away, but the way she moved getting down told the truth. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put coffee on." I unsaddled both horses and put them in the corral and carried her flour and her lamp oil into the kitchen, and she built a fire in the stove one-handed, favoring her right side, and I didn't offer to help because she hadn't asked, and I could read the line between help she'd take and help she wouldn't. The kitchen was clean. That's what I noticed most. Not decorated, not fancy, there wasn't money for fancy, but clean and organized, everything in its place, the kind of order that takes daily effort in a ranch kitchen. There were dried herbs hung from a beam above the window. The table had a cloth on it, white with a blue stripe. She set the coffee to boil and turned around and leaned against the stove with her arms crossed, not against me, just holding herself. "How bad is it?" I said. "My back." "Your situation." She looked at me for a moment. "Bad," she said. "Delving controls most of the credit in town. Without credit I can't get through winter. I have 3 horses, 40 head of cattle, and no hired hand since February because the last one was told by Delving that working for me would put him on the wrong side of things." She said it plainly, without self-pity, which made it worse. "I have a son. He's 12. He's at school in Millhaven with his aunt until I can get things settled here." "You sent him away." "I sent him away," she said. "Yes." So she was alone on this piece of land, fighting a man with money and reach and a hired gun, and she'd sent her son away so he wouldn't be in it with her, and she'd stood in the street this morning and taken a bullwhip without making a sound, because making a sound would have given Delvin something he could use. The coffee boiled. She poured it. I drank it at her table and she sat across from me, and neither of us spoke for a little while, and outside the kitchen window the cottonwoods along the creek showed their undersides, which meant there was a wind building from the west. "What do you do, Virgil Kane?" she said. "Whatever I'm hired to do," I said. "Mostly range work, some cattle work, some other things." "Some other things," she repeated. I drank my coffee. "Those other things you do," she said. "Are they the reason you know what kind of man Del Farris is without me having to say it?" "Probably." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. Then she looked up at me. "I can't pay you," she said. "I want to be plain about that. I haven't got what I'd need to hire a man like you." "I didn't ask for pay," I said. "No," she said. "You didn't. But I'm not going to have you staying here under a misunderstanding about what I can offer, so I'm being plain." I respected that. I respected it a good deal. "I'll stay through tonight," I said. "Make sure Farris doesn't come out here after dark. In the morning we can figure out what comes next." She looked at me for another moment. Then she nodded once and got up and started making lunch. That was how it began. I slept in the barn that first night, which is what was right, and I was awake twice when I heard horses on the road. Once it was nothing. Once it was a single rider who came to the north fence line and sat there for maybe 10 minutes in the dark and then went back the way he came. I didn't go out to him. I stood in the barn doorway with my rifle and watched him, and he either knew I was there or decided against whatever he'd come to do, and then he left. In the morning I told Nora. She listened, and she didn't say "I told you so" or "I should have left." She just said, "The fence on the north line," and I said, "I know," and she said, "I'll need to check it after breakfast." We checked it. A post was down and 2 strands of wire were cut, and 3 of her cattle had gone through. We found them in the next hour without too much trouble. The grass on the other side wasn't as good as what they'd left, and ran them back, and I hammered the post, and she held the wire while I strung it, and we worked alongside each other without much talking, the way you do when both people know what a job needs. It was not work I'd planned to be doing. I had that job waiting in Wyoming, or maybe waiting, and for all I knew Foss had given it to someone else by now. I stayed 3 more days. On the 4th day, I rode back into Hatcher's Creek. I had a list from Nora, a short one, things she needed, and I had my own reasons for going, which were that I wanted to have a look at Cord delving in daylight without a woman on her knees between us. You learn things about a man by watching him when he doesn't think he needs to perform. I wanted to see what he was. What he was, I found out, was a man who was careful. He saw me the moment I came into the street. I watched him see me, a small adjustment in how he was standing outside his warehouse, talking to two men, and he kept talking to those two men and didn't look at me again, and that carefulness told me something. A man who goes straight back to bluster when he sees you again isn't worried. A man who gets careful is either afraid or planning, and Cord Delvin didn't look afraid. I bought Nora's supplies and stopped in at the sheriff's office. The sheriff was named Pot, Abel Pot. He was 60, heavy in the middle, wearing a badge that looked like it hadn't been polished in some time. He had the particular look of a man who has held a difficult job in a small place for a long time and has made his accommodations with it. I sat across from him and told him what I'd seen in the street. He listened without interrupting. "Nora Prout," he said when I finished. "Yes." He looked at the window. "Elias Prout was a good man," he said. "Couldn't manage money any better than a 10-year-old, but a good man otherwise. His widow seems capable enough." "She is," he said. "Nora's always been the steadier of the two." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened in the street? I was not there. I heard about it. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Kane. The way things stand between Delvin and this county, I'm in a difficult position." "How difficult?" I said. He looked at me then. "Delvin owns the note on this building," he said, "and the note on 3 other buildings in this town, and he is owed money by men who do business here, and those men constitute most of the tax base I operate on." He said it without excusing himself, which I gave him credit for, just laid it out. "I am not a brave man, Mr. Kane. I want to be honest with you about that." "All right," I said. "But I'm not a corrupt one either," he said. "What he did in that street was wrong. What he's been doing to Nora Prout is wrong. If you are inclined to do something about it, I won't be in your way. I can't promise more than that." I thought about that walking back to my horse. It was not the most reassuring thing a lawman had ever said to me. It was also, I decided, more honest than most of what lawmen had ever said to me. On the ride back to the Prout place, I thought about Wyoming and the job that was either waiting or wasn't, and Foss, and what he'd do if I arrived 2 weeks late. Foss was not a patient man. The job was probably gone. I thought about that, and I thought about Nora Prout standing in that kitchen making lunch one-handed because her back hurt too much to use both arms, and I thought about the rider who'd stood at the north fence line in the dark. When I got back to the ranch, Nora was in the corral working one of the horses, a big roan that didn't particularly want to be worked. She was doing it right, patient, consistent, talking to the horse in a low voice, not fighting it. I watched her for a while from the fence. She noticed me watching and came over. "How bad?" she said. "Delvin's planning something," I said. "I don't know what yet." "He wants the land," she said. "He wants you gone," I said. "The land's what he gets after." She looked at the roan for a moment. He'd gone back to standing in the far corner of the corral, ears pinned. "My father built this place," she said. "He homesteaded it in '63. 12 years he worked this ground. Then I grew up on it, and Elias and I were married here. My son was born in that house." She said it quietly, not as an argument, as a fact. "I will not leave it." I didn't have anything to say to that was worth saying. "All right," I said. What came next came fast. 4 days after I rode into town, Del Ferris and another man showed up at the south fence line at dusk. I saw them from the barn, 2 riders, stopping just at the property edge. Nora was in the house. I came out of the barn with my rifle and stood in the yard in full view, and they sat on their horses looking at me for a while, and then they rode off south. 2 nights after that, someone put fire to the far corner of the hay barn. I caught it early. I was not sleeping well in those days. lying awake listening for horses, and I had it out before it took the structure, but it took the hay in that corner and left a scorch mark along the wall that told me exactly what it was. Not accidental. Low on the outside wall, the kind of start a fire gets when someone sets it. Nora stood in the yard at 2 in the morning with soot on her hands and looked at what was left and didn't say anything for a long time. "I'm going into town tomorrow," I said. "Virgil." "I'm going to talk to Delving directly," I said. "No middleman, no Ferris, him." She turned to look at me. Her face in the moonlight was very still. "What will you say?" she said. "I'll tell him the same thing I told him in the street," I said. "That there's a line, and that I'm it." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "He won't listen." "No," I said, "but after I say it, whatever happens next is on him and not on me, and that matters to me." She was quiet, then she said, "Come inside, I'll put the coffee on." So we sat at her table at 2:30 in the morning, both of us smelling of smoke, and drank coffee, and she told me about her son, whose name was Thomas and who was 12 and could ride anything with 4 legs and was trying to learn to read music, which she thought was a good thing for a boy to want. And I told her about the years I'd spent moving from place to place, which I hadn't talked about with another person in longer than I could precisely remember, and she listened the way she did everything steadily, without performance. "Don't you want to stop somewhere?" she said. I looked at my coffee. "I used to think I didn't," I said. She didn't say anything to that, just looked at me. I rode into Hatcher's Creek in the morning and went straight to Delvin's warehouse and walked in without knocking. He was at his desk in the back, going over papers with a man I didn't know. He looked up. I said, "Outside." He came outside. That told me something, that he was still calculating, still running his estimate of what I was worth to him as a problem. A man who thought he could dismiss me entirely would have told me to get out and sent for Ferris. He came outside, and we stood in the alley beside the warehouse where we couldn't be seen from the street. "You set fire to her barn," I said. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "I know what I saw," I said, "and you know I know it, so let's not pretend." I looked at him. "Leave her alone." He looked back at me with those pale eyes. "You're going to leave eventually," he said. "Men like you always leave." "Maybe," I said, "but men like me also sometimes decide to stay. And the way you're going about this, Delvin, you're giving me more reason to stay than to go." He looked at me for a long time. "She can't pay the debt," he said. "I'll pay the debt," I said. That landed different than anything I'd said before. He looked at me and his eyes changed, not afraid, but recalculating, wondering what I was to this woman and what I was worth, and whether I had anything like $400. "By when?" he said. "By the end of the month," I said. 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. "And if you don't?" "Then we'll be back here having this conversation again," I said, "and the next one won't be polite." He nodded once. Not agreement exactly, more like filing it. Then he went back inside and I walked back to my horse, and the street was quiet around me the way streets get when people have watched something happen without quite seeing it. I rode back to the ranch. I did not have $400. I want to be clear about that. I had $32 to my name, which was what was left after the 40 I'd given Delvin and what I'd spent on Nora's supplies. I had 3 weeks and no particular idea of where $400 was going to come from. I told Nora what I'd told him. She looked at me. "You don't have $400, she said. "Not yet," I said. She stood there looking at me with that measuring look she had, the one I'd seen the first day in the street, and then she did something she hadn't done before. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just holding it, holding all of it for a moment. And then she took her hands away and her face was dry and clear, and she looked at me and said, "Virgil, why are you still here?" I thought about Wyoming. I thought about Foss and the job and the next place and the place after that. I thought about 30 years of picking up and riding on, and what that had added up to, which was $32 and a good horse and a bruise above my left eye, and the right to say I'd never been tied to anything I didn't want to leave. "I'm still here," I said, "because I want to be." She held my look for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, not soft, not the movie version of a woman's face going soft, more like something that had been held at attention releasing a single degree. An admission, maybe. An allowance. "There's a cattle buyer out of Caldwell," she said slowly. "Comes through in 2 weeks. I have 40 head if prices are decent." "That's your cattle," I said. "Our problem," she said. And that was when I understood that she had made a decision about me that was different from the one she'd been making before. And I felt the weight of that the way you feel the weight of something you've been carrying shifting onto both shoulders instead of one. I want to tell you about those 3 weeks, because they were their own thing and they matter to the story. I fixed the south fence line the day after I talked to Delving. Then I repaired the barn wall where the fire had taken it. I'm not a carpenter, but I know enough to be useful, and Nora worked beside me, handing up boards and holding them while I nailed. And we didn't talk much while we worked, but the silence between us had changed since the morning after the fire. It had become the kind of silence 2 people share, when they've decided something about each other without having to put it into words. The second week I rode the perimeter of the land. All of it, every fence line, every gate. It took most of 2 days. I found 2 more places where wire had been cut and the posts worked loose, old damage, done over time, the kind that looks like weathering if you're not looking close. I fixed it all. Took me a day and a half with the tools from her barn and some supplies I bought in Hatcher's Creek on one of my runs in. Something happened in Hatcher's Creek in those 3 weeks that I hadn't expected. The first time I went in for supplies after the day I'd talked to Delving, a man outside the general store had given me a look that I read as hostile and then turned out not to be. He was maybe 50, raw-boned, with a face like cracked leather, and he fell into step beside me on the boardwalk for about a dozen steps before he said, "You're the man who's out at the Prout place." "I am," I said. "Nora's all right," he said. "Elias was a fool about money, but she's solid." He said it like he was filing information, not asking anything. "Name's Cal Reedy. I run cattle north of her place. North fence line borders mine." "Virgil Kane," I said. He nodded, didn't shake hands, didn't stop walking, just said, "If you need anything," and then went left at the corner and was gone. That was the beginning of something. By the end of the first week, 2 more men had introduced themselves to me in similar fashion, brief, plain, the kind of introduction that is really a statement of where a man stands. A third came out to the ranch on the Thursday of the second week, a wagon maker named Burl who traded with Nora since she and Elias had been married, and he brought 2 lengths of cedar board she hadn't asked for and helped me finish the barn wall in an afternoon. He ate dinner at her table that evening and talked to her about prices and weather and the condition of the road to Millhaven, and left before dark without making anything of it. I watched all of this and I thought about it. What I thought was that the people in Hatcher's Creek were not all Cord Delving's people, and most of them had known it for a long time but hadn't had a place to stand. When I'd stepped into that circle in the street, I'd given them a place to stand, or at least shown them one was possible. Men like Cal Reedy and Burl, the wagon maker, had been watching and deciding, and what they'd decided was that the circle had a different center now. That is not a small thing. I don't want to overstate my part in it, because Nora Prout had been the center of her own fight for months before I arrived, and the people in that town who respected her had always respected her. But something had shifted. Delvin had shown his hand in the street, and by showing it, he had made a space for people to choose which side of it they were on. Most of them, it turned out, had been waiting to choose. On the Friday of the second week, 2 things happened. The first was that Del Farris came into the general store while I was there buying flour. He came in and he saw me and he stopped. We looked at each other for a moment. He went to the counter and asked for tobacco, and the man behind the counter served him, and he took the tobacco and left. And the whole time he didn't look at me again, and I watched him out the window walk back to Delvin's warehouse. The second thing was that Abel Pott, the sheriff, came out to the ranch that afternoon. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the house and knocked, and Nora let him in and put coffee on, and the three of us sat at the table. "I want to say something to you both," he said. He had his hat in his hands and he was working the brim around slowly. "I should have done more. When Delvin started in on her in December, I should have done more than I did. I want you to know I know that." Neither of us said anything. "I'm going to write to the county marshal in Caldwell," he said. "Tell him what I've seen, what I know." He looked up. "I don't know what comes of it. Delvin's got ties out there too, but I'm going to write the letter." Nora said, "Thank you, Abel." He nodded, finished his coffee, put his hat on and left. She looked at me after he was gone. "He should have done more," she said. "He should have," I said. "But he's doing something now," she said. "He is," I said. She picked up his coffee cup and washed it and set it in the rack, and we didn't say anything more about it. Some things you just let be what they are. We sold the cattle in 16 days. The buyer out of Caldwell came through, and he was a hard man about prices, but we were harder, Nora mostly, because she knew what those cattle were worth in a way I didn't. And when we were done, she had $312. I put in the remaining 88 from a man in Millhaven, who owed me money from a job 3 years back and who I'd long since written off. But I rode out there and sat in his kitchen until he counted it out. It took most of a day. We went to Delvin together. Nora had wanted to go alone. I'd said no, and she'd pushed back, and I'd said it again, and after a moment she'd let it stand. Not because she couldn't have gone alone. She absolutely could have, but she let me be there for it, which was its own kind of thing. Delvin counted the money twice. He did it slowly, with us both standing in front of his desk, and I kept my hands where they were and my face level and let him take his time. When he finished, he looked up at us. "Paid," he said. He said it like a word that tasted of something he didn't like. "In full," I said, "with a receipt." He wrote the receipt. His handwriting was careful and small, the handwriting of a man who had learned it as a skill rather than a habit. He handed it to Nora, not to me, which I noted. Even in defeat, he was making the calculation. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket, and we walked out. In the street she stopped, stood for a moment with her face to the sun, eyes closed, just breathing. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "You paid most of it," I said. "You know that's not what I'm thanking you for," she said. I did know. I just wasn't sure what to do with being thanked for the thing she was thanking me for, which was not the money but the other part of it, the standing there, the drawing the line. We rode home side by side, which was the first time we'd ridden that way. Before I'd always been a half-length behind, watching. I don't know if she noticed. I noticed. Del Farris came out of the trees 2 miles south of the ranch. He came out fast, his horse already at a run, and he came straight at us from the left side, and I saw him before Nora did. I put Cutter between Nora's horse and Farris, and I pulled my Colt from the holster while Cutter was still moving, and when Farris got to within 20 yards, I fired once into the ground in front of his horse. The horse shied and went sideways, and Farris nearly went off. He got control of his horse and he pulled it up and sat looking at me. He was wearing the vest. His face was narrow and white and ugly with something that was trying to be contempt and was mostly just fear. "Next one," I said, "won't be the ground." He sat there for a moment longer, measuring me the way men measure men when they're deciding whether they're going to die today, and then he turned his horse and rode south. Nora had her horse under control. She was watching Farris go. I put my Colt away. My hand was steady. I noticed that without particular pride. It was just what hands did when they'd been at this long enough. Is it done? She said. Close, I said. Men like that don't stay done without someone watching. She looked at me. Are you going to stay and watch? It was a direct question, and she'd asked it looking straight at me. And she knew what she was asking, and I knew what she was asking, and there wasn't any point in talking around it. If you'll have me, I said. The sun was down to the west, going red-orange over the scrub cedar, and the light was doing something to her face that made the lines around her eyes look not like age but like depth, like topography. She looked at me for a long moment, and I let her look, because she had the right to it. She'd earned the right to look at any man who came near her and take her time deciding. Come home, she said. Just that, come home. I followed her the rest of the way to the ranch. In the yard she got down from her horse and I got down from Cutter, and she turned and looked at me, and then she put her hand on my arm, her hand, flat on my forearm, fingers over the sleeve of my coat, and held it there for a moment. Not a grand gesture, not the kind of thing a man tells for the drama of it. Her hand on my arm and her face looking up at mine, and in her eyes something plain and level, something that did not require words. She saw what I was, all of it, the years behind me and the things I'd done and the man I'd come out of all of that as. She looked at me and she saw that man and she put her hand on his arm and she chose to. That was the whole of it. I stayed. In the weeks after, Delvin didn't come. Ferris didn't come. I won't say they were gone for good. Men like that don't go for good. They go until the calculation changes. But the calculation had changed enough that they stayed south for a while, and that was enough. Thomas came home from Millhaven at the end of October. He was a big kid for 12, quiet in the way his mother was quiet, watchful, measuring, not giving much away until he'd decided you'd earned it. He shook my hand in the yard when Nora introduced us and looked at me with the direct brown eyes that were his mother's and said, "She said you helped." "We helped each other," I said. He thought about that, then he nodded. He taught me the 3 chords he'd learned from the music teacher in Millhaven. I was not a quick student. He was patient about it. There's a morning I keep coming back to when I think about that time. November, first frost on the ground, the light coming over the cottonwoods at the low winter angle. I was in the corral with the roan, and Thomas was on the fence watching, and Nora came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed me one through the fence rails, and our hands touched around the cup, and she held on for a second before she let go. Nothing more than that. Frost on the ground and coffee and her hand and the low winter light. I'd moved through a lot of years and a lot of places, and I'd never had a piece of ground I thought of as my own or a woman who handed me coffee through a fence rail with that particular look in her eyes, or a 12-year-old kid teaching me 3 chords with more patience than I deserved. I hadn't known I was missing any of it, which is the way those things work. I know it now. Delvin sold his warehouse and his notes and left Hatcher's Creek the following spring. I never knew why exactly. There were stories, something about a dispute with a man in Caldwell, something about a marshal asking questions. I didn't go looking for the story. He was gone, and that was what mattered. The Prout place, we didn't change the name. It was her father's name and her name and Thomas's, and when Thomas is older and the land passes to him, it will still be Prout land, which is how it should be. I have no argument with that. I have my horse in the barn and my rifle on the wall, and a place at the table in a kitchen with herbs hung from the beam above the window, and a blue-striped cloth on the table. I have a woman who looks at me the way Nora looks at me, which is plain and clear, and with something in it that I can only call the particular kind of steady that comes from choosing a thing on purpose. I did not expect any of this, I want to say that. I came through Hatcher's Creek because it was on the road to somewhere else, and I stopped because I heard a sound I'd heard before and I didn't ride on, and everything that came after came from that one moment of not riding on. Some men would call it luck. I call it the thing that was waiting, the whole time, for me to stop moving long enough to let it catch up. The frost's on the ground again this morning. Nora's in the house. Through the window I can see her moving, and the lamps lit against the gray early light, and the cottonwoods are bare now along the creek, but there's a shape to them, even bare, that tells you the water's still there underneath. Everything you need, right where it was all along.